arzu nikoho na ekranu člověka.
Welcome to our first of what I hope to be many roundtable discussions at Contact Television. The show is called hashtag 450UA. That comes from the hashtag that's popular in the internet when we try and talk about political issues in Ukraine, specifically parliamentary issues. The number 450 comes from the fact that there are 450 seats in Parliament. 5 of them aren't in use right now, so it's only 445, but hopefully that'll be remedied soon, and we're probably going to get to that in one of our upcoming discussions. Today I'm very happy to be joined to my right here by Walter Derzko from the Strategic Foresight Institute. He's also adjunct professor at OCAD University here in Toronto. We're being joined on Skype today by Senior Fellow, Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto, Taras Kuzio. Gentlemen, hello.
Good evening.
Thanks for joining me today. I've introduced you in one way, but I'm going to introduce you in a general way now in another way, and that is that you're both what I would call experts on Ukraine, especially the kind of experts that we need here in what we call the diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora. One of the things that we're going to be doing at hashtag 450UA more than anything is try and have some political discussion that's centered on Ukrainian issues, and we're trying to do it as much as possible in English because I find that that's something that's just not happening. So that's why I wanted to get this going as much as possible. Topics that we are going to discuss today, they're various. I want to get right to the first topic, which would be the EU-Ukraine summit, which just took place. It just took place on Monday in Brussels. For those that are not familiar with that, this is the next step for Ukraine's hopeful integration into the European Union. This summit was scheduled a long time ago, and Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych and his representatives met with EU representatives in Brussels. We're going to hope to get some more details about that from other sources. But from some of the general information that came out in the media, I'd like to bring up a question right now, and I'm going to pose it to you first, Taras. When we talk about the EU-Ukraine summit, my question is this: has the Yanukovych regime understood that it has to play by the EU rules in order to join? And has the EU made those rules clear?
Well, first of all, the EU is not offering Ukraine or any CIS country membership. Let's put that clear. What's on offer is what's called an association agreement. It's what some people would call EU enlargement light, i.e. you're kind of in the house in only an associate way. This will eventually, hopefully, lead to EU membership. But of course, that is something that's very much opposed by other West European countries like Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy, for example. So this is a halfway house. It includes 6 countries in the former USSR outside the Baltic states who are already members. And Ukraine, in terms of Brussels' point of view, Ukraine is the most important and the biggest. Of the 6 members of the Eastern Partnership, Ukraine is by far the largest, and it dwarfs all the other 5. Ukraine is going to be the starship. It's going to be the most important case in the Eastern Partnership for Brussels to be successful in its attempt to reach out and give countries which are on the borders of the EU something which is not quite membership. The EU only began to really criticize developments in democracy in Ukraine from about the middle of 2011. The red line that was crossed by Ukraine was the imprisonment and arrest of Tymoshenko. Why? She was not only the former prime minister, but she was a presidential candidate that was just defeated. So it looked very blatantly like the current president was trying to remove his major potential opponent. And so that was the red line that triggered it. It wasn't everything else that had been going on in the meantime, such as attacks from the media, attacks from civil society, the increase of the SBU as a more KGB organization, and other things. Now, Tymoshenko was sentenced in October of 2011, and so the first stage of the association agreement was initialed, which just means the negotiations have been completed. But the second and third stages, which is the signing of the agreement between Ukraine and the European Council, the highest body of the EU, and then the third stage, which is ratification by the European Parliament and 27 parliaments, has not taken place, and those two stages are frozen. They cannot be unfrozen until Ukraine basically ends selective use of justice. And on this point, Canada, the US, and the EU are in total agreement. There's no dispute between Western countries. So the situation as it stands now is that the ball has been in Yanukovych's court for a long time. Everybody understands there's no independent judiciary in Ukraine. The Prosecutor General, Viktor Pshonka, made a statement just after becoming prosecutor 2 years ago where he said that he is a member of the president's team. So the ball is really in Yanukovych's court. Is he going to maintain a process of selective use of justice, incarcerating his opponents, or is he going to try to abide? I don't think that he understands, going back to your question, understands the way the EU works. I think that they think they can wing it. They think that, in particular, that Ukraine is so geopolitically important that they will get away with it, human rights abuses in the same way as, say, for example, Russia gets away with it. They don't understand that's not the case. Ukraine isn't as important as Russia, doesn't have energy resources, it's not on the UN Security Council, doesn't have nukes. So they think they can get away with it. They now, for the first time, have been given a deadline to abide by. I'm quite skeptical. I'm British, so I'm quite skeptical that the EU can be very tough. It's usually the US that comes in and pushes and prods the EU to be more tougher. So we'll see. We'll see. I don't think the Yanukovych team think they can think that they can sort of somehow understand the EU. I think you have to understand the mentality of the Yanukovych and co. They approach the foreign domain in the same way as they approach the domestic domain. What does that mean? It means that they think that people can be either co-opted, bribed, or hoodwinked. It's very easy for a single country like Canada or the US to have a foreign policy. It's very difficult for an organization which has 27 members to have a single foreign policy.
In terms of Ukraine's path to EU integration, is it solely in the president's hands? I mean, constitutionally, how does this work? What role, say, does the parliament play?
Well, under both the parliamentary and presidential constitutions that Ukraine has had, all of the so-called siloviki, all of the security forces, foreign, defense, prosecutor, SBU, National Security Council, was always in the hands of the president. And in Ukraine, civil society, the media, think tanks, parliament have had far less of a role than in the case of the president of Ukraine. Now, what we have now in Ukraine is that the Ukrainian parliament is pretty much a rubber stamp institution and doesn't really have that much influence. To give you an example, in April 2010, 3 Ukrainian parliamentary committees voted against the Kharkiv Accords to extend the Sevastopol base for the Black Sea Fleet, and Yanukovych went ahead with it.
Walter, the comment.
Just wanted to add what Taras was saying, that really Ukraine has not just crossed the red line with a bunch of the politically motivated sentences and other issues that Taras has mentioned, but really Europe, I think, has come back and drawn a line in the sand, and with rather harsh conditions. They've put out 19 requirements that Ukraine has to meet before the 1st of May. I think it's almost impossible. And I think this was done on purpose so that essentially in all good conscience and political and moral conscience, the EU can then step back and say, okay, we gave you every chance, you didn't meet your requirements, we are now going to the next stage, which could be further, I don't want to say sanctions at this point, but further repercussions in terms of the regime. The other thing that I think is critical is that I was reading the memorandum that came out today, the statement of the 16th EU summit, and most of it was typical diplomatic speak. The one that I don't think got enough notice was topic 13, and I'll just read briefly. This is a quick translation of what came out in Ukrainian. This was point 13 that had to do with the energy issue. It says that leaders took note of the 7th report of the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding on Energy Cooperation and reaffirmed that Ukraine as a transit country remains a reliable partner of the EU, which aims to provide a stable and safe movement of gas to Europe. They also stressed the importance of Ukraine's gas transit system for transporting gas to EU member states. The EU will continue to support the modernization of the Ukrainian gas transport system as a key part of the European grid. And then it goes on to say that leaders noted with satisfaction that from November 2012, Ukraine joined the EU gas market through the effective gas flow in two directions. Now that absolutely terrifies Russia. I could never understand why Russia wanted control of essentially an antiquated 40, 50-year-old gas transit system. And I think the reason is that they definitely want to see gas flowing in one direction from the east to the west. And here we see a threat that if Ukraine diversifies its energy prospects, its energy supplies, we could see a partial flow of gas running from east to west, or a total flow of gas running from east to west into Ukraine, not immediately, but within time from Europe. Where does that put Russia? Well, Ukraine is definitely the cheapest gas transit system for Russia. The North Stream and the South Stream, which is being built right now, is tremendously expensive. Russia doesn't have the volume capacity to make those North Stream and South Stream systems pay off. If you see gas flowing one way through Ukraine going eastward and Russia having to resort to the North Stream eventually and the South Stream, that's a recipe for bankruptcy.
Yanukovych made a statement a couple of days ago in which he said that he may consider leasing the gas transport system to Russia. Do you think that might be his way of saying, well, we need money to get this thing back up to par with what we need to transport gas? So he'll get the money from Russia to rebuild it or to refurbish it.
Well, Europe has offered an olive branch $600+ million EBRD loan, which is conditional on IMF agreement, which I don't think they will get. I think that's the most geopolitically most strategic important issue right now, far beyond language, far beyond culture, far beyond anything else. If Ukraine loses control to Russia in any way of the gas transit system, they're essentially sunk as a sovereign state.
Saras, the money that Walter mentioned that Ukraine got from the EU in terms of a loan.
They haven't yet.
Well, okay, so there's been a proposal to get a loan from the EU. What do you say about that? To me, that sounds like a very strong statement that the EU is making to show that they are willing to support Ukraine.
Well, it's a carrot that they're dangling, but as Lodko said, it's dependent on getting an IMF agreement. And the IMF agreement is not likely to happen for a number of reasons. Firstly, Yanukovych said a couple of days ago during his so-called nationwide question time that he is not in favor of increasing household utility prices, and that's a key demand of the IMF. I mean, Ukraine households pay about 20% of the real cost of imported Russian gas, which is the highest price in Europe that Ukraine pays. So if there's no IMF agreement, that's bad in terms of for foreign investors. It sends a signal that Ukraine's not a good place to go, and it also impacts negatively upon EU agreements.
Okay, I'd like to give each of you a chance to maybe wrap up about EU. There are other things I want to talk about. So Walter, I'll give it to you. Either follow up on something or maybe bring up a point to wrap up EU. I mean, there's we could talk about forever the EU Ukraine integration scenario. What would you like to add or sum up with?
Just to look at the transit issue and the energy issue, imagine the following scenario that Ukraine either totally reverses the flow of gas that it's now hitting from Europe into Ukraine. Russia doesn't have a way to pump gas to Europe either except through the Nord Stream and South Stream, which costs trillions of dollars. The capital investment and the capacity the capacity is there, but the volume of gas that Russia can transport through those pipelines simply isn't there. So this is a lost leader for Russia. They will eventually go bankrupt, just like they did just like the Soviet Union went bankrupt in 1989, where they needed to borrow $500 billion from Western banks and Western governments. The West refused, and the Soviet Union essentially is a footnote in history. The same thing could eventually happen to Russia, especially with gas prices being as low as they are, and with Russian sovereign wealth fund being as depleted as it is.
Okay. Well, listen, one thing I'd like to do is let everybody know that I'm not going to hide some of our technical difficulties here. I learned from Leo Laporte, and if you don't know who I'm talking about, then look him up. This is the way to do it. We have lost Taras on Skype, but I'm going to try and bring him back via telephone. This might be a better option because I see that we're not really getting any kind of a transmission from him via Skype. So give me a second here. Okay, so Taras, if you could just let me know if we sum up the EU-Ukraine situation as it pertains to the summit and where we are looking for Ukraine to head. What can you give us for a closing word?
Well, this is a really difficult question to answer because because of the fact that Yanukovych is literally boxed himself into a corner. If he releases Timoshenko, Lutsenko, as is demanded by Brussels now, they are going to take part in the 2015 presidential elections. Because one of the demands of Brussels, Washington, and Ottawa is that not only are they released, but that they are allowed to participate fully in political life. Yanukovych dreads that. He expected to win by a massive landslide of at least plus 10% in 2010. He barely won the election. If Timoshenko stands in 2015, I suspect that she will win in a free election. Now, so I just can't see Yanukovych releasing both of them. He might release Lutsenko because he's already spent half of his sentence in prison, so he could be released on parole, and he's very ill. But, that won't buy Brussels. I mean, they are demanding also Timoshenko. So what Yanukovych will do in this situation is extremely difficult. Now, the bigger question here is, as is demanded by some organizations like the World Council, World Congress of Ukrainians, is should the EU go ahead and sign the agreement regardless of that? In many ways, this is a kind of moot point because it's already gone too far. The EU is not going to do that anyway. So the fact that the World Congress of Ukraine is demanding that and is going in that direction is in some ways quite irrelevant, and in some ways actually just basically reiterating and promoting the argument made by the Yanukovych administration, which is also saying, look, we're very geopolitically important, ignore our human rights problems, once we're inside, trust us, and we'll do the reforms that you require. It's very strange that the World Congress of Ukrainians believes these two myths promoted by the Yanukovych administration, because nobody in Ottawa, Washington, or Brussels believes them. So that's one point. And the second point is, to what degree and from where does the World Congress of Ukrainians have a mandate for its members to actually follow a policy of appeasement towards the Yanukovych administration? That's the other point on this. They're actually behind the times. Things have moved on so much in terms of Western governments and the EU that really their position is now irrelevant. intentions to deal with these problems, and he hasn't done it. But there is basically no more any trust in the IMF, US, Canada, or EU in the Yanukovych administration. And that was seen in the last year or so when Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, and Angela Merkel all refused to have their photographs taken with the Yanukovych international summits and basically ignored them. So the level of trust is practically down to zero, and the ball is in Yanukovych's court. They know what they have to do.
Okay.
They can't keep lying and trying to wing it. So let's see where they go from here.
Okay, before we go to the next topic, then last word to Walter.
Ukraine's had 3 years, actually 5 years of negotiations and 3 years of the Yanukovych government to make progress on these 19 criteria which the EU is demanding. They've not only have they not made progress, they've retreated in a number of areas. So I don't think that the deadlines that have been set by May will be accomplished. My biggest fear is that this will give Yanukovych carte blanche, essentially, because since that's no longer on the table, we're going to see the start of repressions in Ukraine, especially against the opposition, that we probably haven't seen since the 1940s or 50s. That's my biggest fear of what's going to happen.
Okay, well, we all understand why the EU-Ukraine summit was important, and the continuing talks are important because that's a geopolitical issue. There's historical reasons for all that that's important. I want to move away from Europe right now, and I want to come over to Canada. Question to you, Taras. How does Canada... the question is this. Is Canada doing its part in making bilateral relations with Ukraine work for the Ukrainian people rather than the current ruling elite and their various associates? That's my concern about the foreign policy issues coming out of the United States and Canada. Do these governments realize that it's a lot more important to, yes, be kind and be diplomatic and all that, but I think they really I think that Canada, for example, I think really needs to start making some bold statements about how the people will be supported, because it seems like this ruling class in Ukraine is toying with the Canadian government.
This issue has come up before, and I think that what hasn't been done until now, and what would be great to send a shot across their bows, is for Canada maybe to lobby to prepare a joint statement with the US and the EU together. And that hasn't been done in the last 3 years. A joint statement by two countries and the EU would actually be very powerful, because it would send a signal to Kiev that everybody's on board on the same position.
How would something like that happen to us?
Well, obviously it will take a lot of backroom lobbying, discussion, but somebody has to begin the process. Canada could be a great country to do that. Canada doesn't get much attention in the Ukrainian media. The attention tends to be focused on the US and the EU, and from the viewpoint of the Kiev elites, they are only really afraid of the US, and that's why they pump in so many millions into Washington lobbyists and political consultants. The key country, of course, in terms of potential action and sanctions, is the US, and then with Canada and the EU following on. But somebody needs to plant these ideas in Ottawa, in the minds of David and the Harper government, to then maybe begin backroom negotiations or discussions as to the idea that it would be very good if everybody was on the same page, as it were, and that there's no possibility that the Ukrainian authorities can think that they can pick off individual countries. I'm less optimistic, I always have been, than Derzko about sanctions, because Derzko's been predicting sanctions for 2 years. And the reason is because, again, because I'm cynical about the EU. You have to remember that there are 8 countries in the CIS who are authoritarian. There's only sanctions against one of those countries, Belarus, which is also already a bit of a double standards here. I mean, why are there not sanctions against Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, for example? The reason they're against Belarus is partly because it's a European country, partly because it's small enough to pick on. It doesn't have, for example, energy like Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan. Ukraine is potentially more similar to Belarus than these other CIS countries, but no sort of sanctions will take place unless the U.S. really pushes for it. At the moment, the U.S. has not got its eye on the ball. Ukraine isn't really a priority for the Obama administration. I don't believe the EU will go ahead with sanctions unless the U.S. pushes for it. Now, what, of course, we should be pushing for is that in any such threat, if it comes out in a statement, in a joint statement, that sanctions should be directed specifically against individual Ukrainian elites, not against the Ukraine as a country.
Okay.
That there should be visa liberalization for the general public,
Right.
whereas visa sanctions for individual Ukrainians, and including oligarchs.
Right.
Because the idea is that although they're not part of the government, such as Mr. Akhmatov, Mr. Firtash, they're nevertheless part of the political machine.
Okay.
And you know, Horashkovsky is being pushed out, his TV station is being forcibly taken over by Firtash and Lavochkin. So it's pretty obvious that who that list should include.
Okay. So.
This is long overdue.
So just on that point, Taras, the question of sanctions to me is a really complicated one, and it doesn't have to be, because I think what we're looking at, Walters, we're looking at sanctions not in the general sense that people may imagine them to be. These are going to be very specific, very, very direct sanctions, and those are even the harder ones to do when you're trying to have them aimed at the ruling elite.
Well, the problem with sanctions is that in most cases they're never public. We know that there were Ukrainian oligarchs that were on a blacklist until recently in the U.S., and with lobbying that was reversed. We know that Austria has been examining the assets of Kuzio in Austria. That is being looked at in terms of money laundering and other illegal issues. Even though I have no proof, I suspect that we may have already seen sanctions in Canada. The fact that Mr. Kuzio didn't show up at the Canada-Ukraine Chamber of Commerce Forum, and he didn't show up in the United States the weekend after. I have no proof of it, but I suspect that there may have been some visa issues associated with that, and we'll probably never know until that information gets released 50 years or so from now in the archives. I can't see why Mr. Kuzio would go to Saudi Arabia rather than Canada or the United States or Washington to lobby for money for their investment projects. So I think we may have seen the start of that. I think that we should be Canada, and the experts I've talked to, and I'm definitely not an expert in the area of mafia and money laundering, but I'm told Canada is considered the safe haven for money. The mafia does all their dirty work in the United States, but they keep their money in Canada because it's safe, quiet, and nobody rocks the boat. So I think there's more than enough areas here that if the government wanted to explore the whole issue of international money laundering, they could probably open those doors. But again, as Taras was saying, that requires the right amount of lobbying in Ottawa.
What about that point, Taras, that Walter made about a specific sanction in terms of the blacklist type of sanction? That's probably not something that's made public. When Kuzmin was refused entry into the U.S., no one really gave any kind of an explanation about it. The State Department said it was not really, I don't remember exactly what their position on it was, but we didn't find out much from the State Department about those sanctions. I remember reading one of the transcripts of a press conference that they had. Can you say anything else to that effect about the quiet sanctions? Is that maybe a phrase that we can use here?
Well, I think that the only person we know of at the moment who's basically on the visa blacklist in many ways is Yanukovych himself. I mean, in 2012, he's not invited by a single Western government to have a state visit. And he Chicago, Davos, or to Brussels to the EU. But no Western governments have invited Yanukovych. So he's already out of the picture. As for Kuzmin, again, as Derzko said, the U.S. never talks about who they put on visa blacklist. But Kuzmin, his case is very specific. He's been basically traveling to the U.S. in the last couple of years, not informing the Department of Justice and going around the U.S. seeking evidence to back up the claim that Tymoshenko was involved in the murder of Yevhen Chernobyl. This is a no-no. You can't do that kind of thing because you're a government official. And in particular, he basically applied strong blackmail pressure against Petro Kirichenko, who was an associate of Lazarenko, who was also defected to the U.S. at the same time as Lazarenko, but turned state witness and gave testimony against Lazarenko. Now, Kirichenko's wife was put in jail in Ukraine last year for about 3 months when she visited Ukraine, and that was used to pressure Kirichenko in the U.S. To give testimony to Kuzmin, who was there illicitly, as it were, to collect evidence on the case against Tymoshenko. So these kind of things have basically led to Kuzmin being put on a de facto blacklist. But we don't know about anybody else. I doubt very much Kuzio is on the list because he's a nobody. He's not important. And he probably didn't come to Canada at the time because of the screw-up over the signing of the LNG terminal agreement. Remember
Right.
an imposter turned up and signed on behalf of some Spanish company. So I don't think Kuzio is really important here. But obviously the people who are important we all know of. They're in the Ukrainian government. So whether that will happen, I myself personally believe that nothing like that will really come into force until after the 2015 presidential election.
Okay.
Because I just don't see how those elections can take place without massive election fraud of a scale far worse than 2004.
Okay.
And if that's the case, then the West will have no choice but to apply that. But whether they'll do it before then, I somehow doubt it. I think that will be left open, as it were. Particularly, as I said, the two main problems are in both the case of the U.S. and in the case of the EU. Ukraine is just not a priority case, and they have so many internal problems. For example, Italian election results today. They have so many internal problems and so many economic problems that Ukraine is just not something they really want to deal with as a major priority.
Okay. Gentlemen, I want to wrap this up. I want to combine our last two topics into one topic, just in the interest of time. So I did want to talk about Tymoshenko and Lutsenko and their incarceration, and the fact that when I look at what's happening in Ukraine, I find the grassroots support does not seem to be there for these people. I thought that if there was passion about these political prisoners, if there was some kind of a feeling that a street movement would really make a difference, that we would have seen this by now, especially with the fact that both of these have been in jail for over a year, in Lutsenko's case much longer than Tymoshenko. So that's the one thing which is what I wanted to bring up. But the other thing is, and I'll tie it into to that previous topic, the last topic that I wanted to bring up was the fact that the Canadian diaspora, to me, is also either in a state of confusion or just in a state of unpreparedness. I'm not quite sure what it is. I thought that, here's my question. Do you think the Ukrainian diaspora, for example, the people that want to be active and the people that want to help, do you think that they're looking at the daily pictures that are coming out of Ukraine, if they watch Piatый Kanal or if they watch TVI, they're reading Ukrainska Pravda, they're reading the Kyiv Post. Do you think they see the lack of action in Ukraine, and we think to ourselves here in Canada, well, if there's nothing really happening there, then I'm not sure I want to be carrying a placard around here or anything else. I'll throw that at you first, Walter. What do you think?
Well, definitely there's growing disenchantment both in the diaspora and in the Ukrainian population. Ukraine is in a recession now. Their GDP dropped 0.9% in the last quarter. People are losing jobs. People are being threatened in terms of their political activities, so they realize that those risks are on the rise. There's all kinds of other hardships that people have to face Ukraine, and Lutsenko and Tymoshenko, unfortunately, has just dropped off the radar screen. That's unfortunately an economic reality in Ukraine right now. Not that there aren't groups of people supporting them. I mean, just look on Facebook or on VKontakte or Odnoklassniki. The fact that people are calling for the assassination of a president, of Yanukovych, is just unheard of. I mean, I'd never would expect that to that extent, even though it may be on a joking scale or on a comedic scale, but still, you don't see that in any other country. So, I mean, there's definitely disenchantment. There's definitely let's call it a mental revolt, but I don't see that sort of translating into street action as we saw during or before the Orange Revolution.
Well, one thing I can say before I go to you, Taras, is that I spend quite a bit of time on Facebook, on Twitter, and, you know, I'm not posting pictures of dancing cats or anything like that. I'm actually spending 90% of my time looking at what's going on in Ukraine and trying to communicate with Ukrainians on these matters. One group that's quite active in terms of generating a lot of discussion online is the Canadian Group for Democracy in Ukraine. Now, the Facebook group is basically a discussion group. The people that post in that group are not necessarily supporters of the Canadian Group for Democracy in Ukraine. But what I do like is that there is a forum there where people are debating issues, whether it's the language issue, whether it's political incarceration. You know, there's all sorts of things happening there. As far as letters that are, for example, being published by the Canadian Group for Democracy in Ukraine, I know that letters have been sent to the Prime Minister, to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'm actually, Taras, we talked about this with some of the members of the Canadian Group for Democracy in Ukraine. I mentioned anyways, I remember during one of our last teleconferences, that it would be good to actually take this parliamentary friendship group that has formed in the Canadian Parliament and actually have them extend their hands across the ocean so that they can speak to parliamentarians. I don't know to what extent that's active. It doesn't seem like they're releasing any kind of statements to that effect. The only statement that was released was the embassy, the Ukrainian embassy in Canada, that the new ambassador who came here recently, he had a meeting with the representatives of the Canada-Ukraine Parliamentary Friendship Group. So again, I've thrown a bunch of things around here. Taras, what can you tell me? What do you think from your point of view? What is it that the Canadian diaspora should be doing? Is it the leadership that's maybe not giving them something to work with here? Should it be more of a grassroots thing like Canadian Group for Democracy in Ukraine? How do you see it playing out in Canada, and what the large Ukrainian emigre community should be doing here?
Well, I think there's a mixture of things happening. I think that I don't think that Ukrainian Canadians or Ukrainian Americans are looking at the weakness of protests in Ukraine and saying, why the hell should we not do something then as well? I think it's more a question that, first of all, you have a generational change. The old generation, which was very active, my father's generation, they're leaving us now. And I think that generations below us, the middle and younger generation, are just not politically active. I mean, I know that when I give talks to Plastinate or Sydney, they're not interested in politics, just like most young people in the West. Secondly, there's widespread disillusionment in Ukraine with all politicians, just as there is in the Ukrainian diaspora. The Ukrainian diaspora is very disillusioned with the Yushchenko presidency, the failure of the Orange Revolution to bring benefits and changes to Ukraine, and of course it's shocked by developments since 2010. So those feelings which exist in Ukraine have their positions also in the Ukrainian diaspora. And I think that the third factor is that you have the continuation of basically the Yushchenko nationalist position. The leaders of Cook and their judgment and makes them not really care about the human rights issues surrounding Tymoshenko and Lutsenko. I think that we have to be careful as to how we extrapolate disillusionment in this context in Ukraine. Just because people are not out on the streets in massive rallies protesting about the rollback of democracy and the Tymoshenko and Lutsenko cases isn't to say that when it came to an election, like a presidential election in particular, that they wouldn't vote in massive numbers against Yanukovych. This is where we have this is where the authorities have a major problem. Because 2015 would be far worse for them to win than 2004. In 2004, Yanukovych was relatively popular. He was presiding over 12% GDP growth. He was popular in his home base of East Ukraine because he was a tough regional governor. And he received only 8% less than Yushchenko in the rerun second round. In 2015, he'll be unpopular. He may have, if he's lucky, 20%. He'll be presiding over a sluggish economy or a declining economy. And he'll be the incumbent. He won't have the advantage of being in opposition. How the hell are you able to go from 20% to, say, 48% or even 52% to win a presidential election? In Ukraine, you can do election fraud of up to a maximum of 3%. You can't do it in the range of 20% as in, say, Belarus or Russia. So that's where he has a major problem. Now, if by some miracle Tymoshenko is released and she stands in the election in 2015, I have no doubt that she would win the second round. The problem, though, for her, would be that a huge chunk of those votes, probably maybe 2/3, would be negative votes. They wouldn't be for Tymoshenko, they would be against Yanukovych. This is where I think the danger is for the authorities. Twofold. That in 2015, this discontent that you have in Ukraine, which is not visible on the streets, would come out in a presidential election, particularly in the second round of Ukrainian presidential elections, where both sides vote negatively against the other candidate. And in 2015, Yanukovych is faced by two problems. He could have a massive landslide of negative votes against him, plus his own home base will not maybe come out in large numbers to vote for him. So the protest against all voters that worked against Tymoshenko in 2010 will work against him in 2015. And that means that he has a very difficult possibility of winning a second term. But he cannot not win a second term. I mean, he's boxed himself into such a corner that if he's out of office, he's likely to go to jail for a whole host of reasons. And that's why, therefore, it's very difficult to predict where he's going to go with these EU demands.
Yeah, jail is a place that Yanukovych is familiar with, but I think it's been some time since he's been there, right? But
well, the other.
I wrote an article in last year where I said that Yanukovych awaits either a third term or a third sentence.
Well, or he immigrates to some friendly country like Russia or Israel that will take him. In the meantime, he tries to steal as much as he can with his cohorts, and that's his end game.
All right, don't give him any ideas. Don't give him any ideas. All right.
Unfortunately, there's just one other scenario as well, and that whoever goes into the second round, and it will be against him at the moment if they're not released, Tymoshenko, Lutsenko, in the second round, Yanukovych will face either Yatsenyuk or Klitschko. And I don't really believe either of them are strong enough willed. And so Yanukovych can either try to win a second term, or he can basically buy one of these two people off. I mean, that's the other potential scenario.
Okay.
We will see where developments go on this.
Okay. Thank you.
They box themselves into a corner. Whatever steps they take, they're going to lose.
Okay. In the interest of time, gentlemen, we have to wrap up. I'd like both of you to think of a quick 1-minute summation. I'm still going to give you a chance to say one more thing each because something very specific, and that is what do we look forward to? I'll hope to get together with both of you soon. And what should we be thinking about unless something comes up that, of course, we can't foresee. But leave me with something that that you'd like to wrap up with that we should be looking ahead to. I'll let you think about that for a second. I'm just going to remind our viewers and our listeners that you have been listening to and you have been watching hashtag 450UA on Contact Television and on various other online sources. I want to thank my guest today. We had Taras Kuzio, Senior Fellow and Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto, and Walter Derzko from the Strategic Foresight Institute. He's also Adjunct Professor at OCAD University in Toronto. And my name is Andy Holowaty. Some people know me as Andy Holowaty. Take your pick. We'll hope to see you many more times on Contact Television and on hashtag 450UA. I'm going to hand it over to Taras right now to give us a quick, if you can, 1 minute summation in terms of some of the things we've talked about today, but what we should look forward to. Please, Taras.
Well, what we should look forward to is that the bulldozer that happened in Ukraine in 2010, 2011, where you saw a massive across-the-board rollback of various gains and national identity issues undertaken by the Yanukovych administration, is now basically ground to a halt. They're in a situation of tremendous financial problems, economic problems. They are totally internationally isolated. They have bad relations in Moscow, bad relations with the West. And they're facing up to the fact that Ukraine, as we know, we in Kuzio many years ago, Ukraine is not Russia. To try and establish a complete monopoly of political and economic power in Ukraine is not going to happen. And so maybe what we are seeing now with the help of Western governments and the EU in particular with these demands and this timetable is the beginning of a rollback in the other direction against Yanukovych. Certainly, we only have about a year and a half to go before the presidential election campaign begins, and so this could be now our counterattack, I think the launching of a counterattack to take back the country that was stolen from us in 2010, 2011.
Okay. Lotko, Walter?
I think that between now and the Eastern Partnership Summit that's going to be held in Vilnius in November 2013, I think we're going to see some surprises. I'm looking for the opposition in Ukraine, all three fractions, to continue to push for to be an effective opposition, which up till now they haven't been. I'm optimistic in that sense. I'm optimistic that the West is going to continue to push demands on the Ukrainian government, and as we discussed, hopefully that's going to be done in collaboration with Canada, the U.S., and the EU, and look forward to, I think, more surprises during the summer, especially in August.
Okay, thank you very much. Люди добрі, ті, що не зрозуміли, про що ми говоримо сьогодні, я вас прошу, щоб ви вивчали англійську мову і щоб ви використовували англійську мову, тому що Україні це дуже багато поможе. The next time you join us, we will be talking about some of these issues in terms of following up, and we'll bring up new issues. Again, gentlemen, thank you very much. And to the viewers and to the listeners, be careful when you log out and shut down. Goodbye.